Hey, Mike with Nerd Problems Gaming here, the channel where we go through the good and bad of everything nerdy to make sure you spend your time on the best of the best. In today's video, I'll be doing a review and how to play video on the deck building game WarRift, so let's get into it. So WarRift is a player versus player competitive deck building game where each player is trying to gain the most valor points by defeating monsters, but also trying to eliminate the competition at the same time. Now this game has a lot of different variants and ways that you can play the game. So before I go into my full review of the game, let's jump into how to play some of the most common variants, and then I'll jump into my review after that. All right, now that we got the game out, let's walk you through how to actually play the game. Now with WarRift, it's a player versus player deck building game, and there's actually several different ways that you can actually play the game. So in my video, I'm gonna cover the classic mode, as well as the casual mode, as those are probably the most common ones that you'll be playing in the game. Now there's also a solo mode to the game as well, and there's also many different variants that you can play throughout the game, but we'll be sticking to the main versions of how to play the game in this video. So in order to win the game, you need to slay monsters to earn valor points. And then when a player reaches 20 points, each other player has a final turn before the game ends. And the surviving player with the most points at the end of the game wins. And you can also extend the game to have a longer play session by playing to 30 points instead of 20 points. Now the first step of playing the game in classic mode is each player chooses a guild. And so there's 4 different guilds to choose from: Spell Strike, Night Fang, Soul Guard, and Grave Rend. If you are playing a 5-player game, that is an option, and 1 player can actually play as the Maw, which is the monster deck. But in most games, you're going to be choosing between one of the 4 main decks you see here. The next step is each player chooses a power card from one of the 3 associated with each guild type. So let's say, for example, I'm going to play as the Spell Strike, and then we'll use Grave Rend as the other player. So I'll choose this as my power for now, and then this is my power over here. They'll be using this deck, and then we'll be using this deck. Now I've already done it, as you can see, but you want to separate out the mages and warriors from the deck. And so there's going to be 7 mages and 3 warriors that start as your base card of your deck. So you'll take these, shuffle them, and put them in the deck pile. Same thing for the other player. The rest of the cards in the deck will have the associated color for that deck type, and you will simply shuffle them, and these become your guild for each player. You'll also flip up 3 cards in the guild selection area for your player. Now, as you play the game, these numbers in the bottom right corner are the cost to purchase the cards, and you'll earn that from the mages that you have and other cards you might buy later on in the game. So when you first get started, you do have the option to refresh the guild selection if you don't like the cards that are here, or maybe you think the numbers are too high and you don't want to buy them starting off of the game. So to do that, you would simply put all the cards at the bottom of the guild and then flip up 3 new cards to create your guild selection. Players also take 5 cards from their deck, and this forms their starting hand for the game. There is an optional rule of Rifter's Blessing, and this grants an additional card at the start of the game to the player who deals the rift. We won't be using that rule though as we play, but that is an option. Next, be sure to shuffle all of the Maw cards, as this contains the monsters for the game. There is also an easy start option that you can do, which means that you put all the iron monsters on the top of the deck equal to the number of the players at the start of the game. This simply creates an easier version of the game, because sometimes harder monsters flip up that you can't necessarily kill until later in the game. If there's a 5th player in the game, they receive the Demon Master card and the Cataclysm cards. But again, we won't be playing with 5 players in this version, so you can skip that step for now. Also, the Demon Master always goes first in the turn order if you happen to be playing a 5-player game. You also want to set up the Rift and Necropolis. Simply place that playmat out. Each player will then draw a card from their guild, and the player with the highest number will get to choose their turn order between all of the players. Refresh this card by placing it at the bottom of the deck for your guild, And if players happen to tie, they just do this process again to see who gets to choose the turn order. Finally, you want to select the monster threshold, and this is the maximum number of monsters that can be in play at the end of a player's turn. If more monsters are in play at the end of a player's turn than is allowed by the threshold, that player is eliminated. So if you want a more challenging game that can eliminate players quickly, choose a lower number for this threshold. If you want a game that will last longer, choose a higher threshold. Now we'll move on to taking a turn. So the first step of the game is to put a monster in play from the monster deck. So again, this is the Maw. You'll just simply flip one of these monsters up that players had the opportunity to kill. Also, if a player has half or more of the winning Valor points, each player puts 2 monsters in play at the start of their turn instead of 1. The next part of your turn is the middle phase, and you can do these in any order you choose. So you can play cards from your hand, you can slay monsters, or you can summon cards. So playing cards from your hand is very simple. You can just lay them out, and then you can calculate how much magicka you have or how much attack you have. Magicka is the blue symbol, attack would be the orange symbol. And you also need to fully resolve the effect of a card before using your attack or magicka points and playing other cards, so you can't half use cards. Also to note, if you need to draw a card at any point during playing cards and you don't have a deck left and all your cards are in your discard pile, reshuffle your discard pile and reform your deck to continue drawing cards. Playing cards from your hand is free. They don't cost any magicka or attack points to play them. And when you happen to play a card that isn't in your guild, it actually goes into the corresponding guild master's discard pile at the end of the turn. One unique aspect of this deck building game when you're playing in classic mode is that when you purchase cards, they will be summoned into the Rift unless designated otherwise. And what this means is that some of these cards can actually end up in an opposing player's hand or deck for a portion of the game. So that's why this rule is in place. To slay monsters, if you choose to do that, you just simply need your attack points among all of your cards that you've played during your turn to be equal to or greater than the number in the bottom right corner. And when you kill this monster, it would then go in your slain monsters pile, and you now have that many Valor points listed on the card. Some cards also do have negative effects called death crashes, and this takes effect when you kill that monster. So just be aware of that. If a monster card has something listed on it that says death crash, you'll need to use that effect when they're killed. You can also combine multiple cards to add up to the total to defeat monsters, and you could also divide points from a card to defeat multiple monsters if you have enough points to do so. Like I mentioned, one thing that's unique to this game, if you do decide to summon cards, there's a couple ways to do it. If you pay 2 points over what the card is listed at in the bottom right, it will immediately go into your discard pile instead of sending it to the Rift. If you pay the exact price listed on the bottom right, it goes to the Rift, and there's a special phase at the end of the round where these cards are distributed. So if you want to make sure that you get the card, you can pay 2 points extra again, and will go immediately to your discard pile. But if not, pay the normal price in magicka, and it will go into the Rift. You may also trade and barter with players as long as one of them is in the middle phase of their turn. Also, if you happen to use your Guildmaster power, this is a one-time use in the game, or again, read the text to see if it's any way different. But once it's been used, flip it over to designate that it's been used. When it comes to the final phase of your game, any unspent magicka points or attack points are lost. They do not carry over to the next turn. Also, damage to attacking monsters that weren't completely killed are removed, so you can't partially kill a monster. You put any of your played cards back into the discard pile of the corresponding Guildmaster, and you'll redraw back up to 5 cards in your hand. Also, whenever you buy something or summon it from your guild, be sure to replace that card right away. You do not reshuffle your discard pile until you are forced to draw. So you could have potentially nothing in your deck until you need to draw a card At that point, you would reshuffle your discard pile. Finally, check to see if the monster threshold was surpassed at the end of your player's turn. If it was, that player is eliminated. Cards on their board and in their hand are removed from the game. Finally, at the end of the round, the player who went first shuffles and deals the rift cards counterclockwise, dealing themselves last. So if there happen to be cards in the rift here, for example, and let's say blue went first, they would shuffle the cards and then they would deal this player and then themselves. And now these cards go face down on top of the deck. Do not look at the cards. And then when it comes to the end of the game, if players are tied for the same amount of valor points, the person that had slain the most monsters wins the game. Now each card has their own specific rules on it, so be sure to read them. For example, this card says consume, and so what that means is you would consume a card and would go into the necropolis, where some cards have abilities to summon cards from the necropolis, for example. Another thing to note is that some cards talk about iron, bronze, silver, and gold monsters or cards. You can see here the associated symbol and what that means, basically 1, 2, 3, or 4. So look for cards that say that, and that's what it means. The card would need that corresponding symbol to be matching that specific type. So again, play would just simply continue in this fashion, players taking turns until one player reaches that 20 valor points threshold. At that point, the remaining players would have one more turn to attempt to gain more valor points and win the game. All right, another way to play the game is in casual mode. And so how this mode works, it's very similar to classic mode, where you start off, the goal of the game is to slay monsters to earn valor points. Again, when a player reaches 20 points, each other player will have a final turn before the game ends, and the surviving player with the most valor points at the end of the game wins. What's different about this game is that all players summon from the same guild. So you're going to create a master guild, and even if you play a card that isn't yours, it still goes into your discard pile at the end of your turn. Another aspect of this is that you eliminate the rift within the game, and anytime you summon a card from your guild selection, it just goes right into your discard pile. You also need to remove certain cards from the game prior to starting, and so check in the rule book for a list of these, but I'll show you them here quickly. It's these ones that say anything related to the rift. Since the rift doesn't exist in the game, you won't be using these cards as you play. Again, consult the rulebook as it gives you a full list, but these are the ones that you need to remove from the game prior to starting. To create the master guild, you just simply combine all of the guild decks into one giant guild deck, shuffle them, and then this is what you'll use for your master guild. Each player starts the game in a similar fashion as well. You'll just simply pick one starting guild deck, again with the 7 mages and 3 warriors, and then you'll pick one of any of the guild power cards to start the game with. And again, each player will share the master guild to buy cards from. So to create that, you take the guild deck and you just flip up 8 cards, and this becomes the storefront or the guild selection that people can buy cards from in the game. Obviously in this example, I didn't shuffle, so they're all the same, but usually it's a variety of different cards when you create this master guild selection that people can buy from. Starting is the same. Each player draws 5 cards, start their starting hand. You shuffle all the red monster cards for the maw again, designate a plate for the necropolis, create the master guild. To start the game in this session, each player draws a card from the master guild looking at the point total. Whatever player has the highest gets to choose what the turn order is. Again, these cards will then be refreshed, placed at the bottom of the deck. For the master guild, you'll select the monster threshold, choosing how many monsters you want to have as the cap. And if players are above it at the end of the turn, that player is eliminated. Again, like I had mentioned, it's casual summoning in this version of the game. So whenever you buy a card from the guild selection, you buy it for the amount listed, and then it goes directly into your discard pile. So you don't have to pay over in order to summon cards that way into your discard pile. There is another variant that you can choose to play if you want, called Turbo Draft. And in this variant, you actually put all of the mages and warrior cards into the necropolis, and then each player will draw 10 cards from the Master Guild, and each player will draft a card, and then it will go to the next player until all players have 10 cards. You'll also always put 4 monsters into play at the start of each player's turn in this turbo draft variant. Otherwise, you'll normally summon monsters how you did in classic mode, where a player will summon 1 monster at the beginning of their turn, or if one player has reached a total of over half of the winning Valor points, then you would spawn 2 monsters at the beginning of a turn. Like I mentioned, there's also a solo mode. Solo mode functions a lot like classic mode. You're just going to be trying to get 30 Valor points by yourself, and it's pretty much like you versus the monsters. You do need to eliminate a couple cards as they are only relevant to multiplayer modes of the game, but definitely consult the rulebook for the full breakdown of how to play solo mode. And there are some different terms that are further explained in the rulebook, so be sure to check for that. If you have questions, or you can certainly comment below this video, and I'll try and answer your questions on how to play the game there as well. But now that you have a better idea on how the game is played, let's jump into my review and how I feel about the game. Well, again, guys, now that you have a better understanding of some of the main modes you can play the game, how do I actually feel about it? Well, this game, like I mentioned, has a ton of variants and a different variety of how you play the game. And so I think that can add a lot of replay value to the game. But for me personally, some of the modes I definitely enjoyed more than others. But I think the main reason for that is most of the time when we played, we were playing 2-player games. And I think some of the variants are better suited for playing with more players. So for example, when you're playing the classic mode in a player versus player mode of just 2 people, when you're drafting the cards and they're going into the rift, sometimes it can feel a bit uneven, and it almost feels like a sense that it's punishing you for buying good cards. Because a lot of times if you buy multiple cards, or if you buy really good cards and the other player buys crappy cards, they might end up getting the cards that you've bought and spent your Magicka points on. Well, they could intentionally buy a bad card because they're the second player, and they might end up getting it first before you have a chance to get it. And so certainly that plays into the strategy of the game, and different guilds kind of have different play styles that can take advantage of the Rift. Some take advantage of the Necropolis, others are suited to buy bigger cards, more cards faster. But I feel like in a 2-player game, some of that balance that the game does have kind of gets a little bit out of whack, and it's often favored for the second player more so than the first player to a fault. But again, I think the classic mode is better suited for groups of players when you're playing with multiple people, because that kind of works itself out, because it's not just you and one other player contributing cards to the game, it's a group of players, and so I think that helps to balance it out as well. Now, like I mentioned, I think each guild type kind of has their own unique advantages and disadvantages and strategies you can use to kind of play off each other. And so that's really cool. But for me, I think the casual mode was definitely more fun to play, especially in a 2-player setting. There is an additional variant that can switch up how cards are divided from the rift, kind of like a breaking point almost, where you set a rift limit of the number of players that are playing. And if you ever put more than that number into the rift, those cards are actually distributed on the beginning of the next player's turn, starting with the previous player. And so that can help balance things out in a sense, but I still think that for a 2-player mode, the casual version is much more fun than the classic version. I also think it's kind of cool where you start with the base deck of cards and then you can completely build your strategy from there, because you can pull from every single guild that's available from that master deck. So again, I prefer that version. Both were definitely fun, but since I spend most of the time playing the 2-player version, I think the casual mode is probably a better choice for most players until they get the hang of it, or if they're playing with more players. Then you can really experience the full strategy of the game when you play it that way. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the monster limits aspect of the game. So you can set a limit of the threshold where if there's a certain number of monsters in the maw above that threshold, that player is automatically eliminated. Again, I think this is best suited for groups of players, not a 2-player game. And depending on how long you want the game is, you probably are better off setting the limit to be rather high. Because in some cases, despite your best efforts, you just might not get dealt the cards that you need early in the game. and it might take a decent amount of time to build up enough tack power to eliminate monsters and stay alive in the game. So depending on what number you set that for, it could be a very quick game, and that might not be as enjoyable. But again, I think maybe the lower numbers of the threshold are probably better suited to a bigger group game compared to maybe 2 or 3 players when you're playing. Another thing I thought was a little unique to the game is that it has the ability to trade and barter with other players. Again, I think this is an aspect that's better suited to a multiplayer game, not just a 2-player game, because we never really found ourselves using that when we were playing 2 players. But I see how you could maybe work together as a bunch of players to kind of sabotage someone that's in the lead by trading cards to earn more points than them and work together as a team to try and win the game. But again, it's still winner takes all at the end of the game. So I'm not really sure how often you would use that bartering system, but it is available in the game, which is a unique twist on a deck building game. The game also has a solo mode, which functions, as I mentioned, pretty much the same as the classic mode. You just eliminate a few cards that apply to multiple players at the same time. But again, for me, I kind of like playing deck builder games versus someone else. And when you eliminate that other player, I think that kind of takes some of the fun out of it. But if you really like deck building games, there is a solo option, so that's cool. I know a lot of them don't necessarily have that, so that's just another cool feature that they do have with this game. But me personally, I prefer playing with more people than just by myself playing a deck builder game. The game also doesn't take super long to play, which is nice. So once you get the hang of it, it maybe takes anywhere from 15 30 minutes tops per player that you're playing with. So games can end pretty quickly, which means you can play it multiple times and play different strategies. And so I think that really adds to the gameplay as well. Overall, I definitely enjoyed the game. There's some unique twists on deck building games in general, and there's some unique strategies and elements that can play into how you play the game, especially with all the different variants. It gives you a lot of variety to choose from when you play. But like I said, my favorite version was the casual mode that functions a lot more like traditional deck building games. But if you're playing with more people, definitely try out the classic mode for a new take on deck building games. But if you guys want to pick up a copy of this game, there'll be a link in the description below where you can do so. If you guys like this video, be sure to smash that like button as it really helps out the channel. If there's other great deck builder games I should check out, let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications to get the latest updates of new nerd videos we put out. And if you'd like to help us pick out content, support the channel, and more, become a patron at nerdproblemsgaming.com/Patreon. And if you'd like to plug into our live streams and Let's Plays we do on the channel, you can follow us on Twitch at nerdproblemsgaming.com/Twitch. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you more soon.